Hey everyone, and welcome back to an exciting day on this channel. We're going to finish the first chapter or rather the last chapter of the first book of the Bible today. We're on Genesis chapter 50. This may or may not be my second time filming this video. So for some reason my mic cut off in the middle of the last video and I filmed the whole thing, but maybe that's God's way of being like, you need to do this again. I don't know. Maybe I said something wrong and he's fixing it. But anyway, we'll do this for the second time. It's usually better the second time anyway. Genesis chapter 50, free PDF down in the description. If you are watching this sometime in the future, there's going to be a physical book that may already be out. There'll be a link down to the Amazon, where you can find that on Amazon down below. Okay, before I mess it up again, Genesis chapter 50, let's answer the questions we always answer. When did the events of this chapter take place? That's our first one. Well, Jacob lived in Egypt for 17 years after he moved down there from Canaan. He lived there until his death, and that would have been in approximately 1689 BC. Joseph is also going to die in this chapter at 110 years old, and that would have been approximately 1635 BC. In terms of our main characters, we've got Jacob. Jacob is the grandson of Abraham, the son of Isaac, and the father of Joseph and his 11 brothers. If you remember, God changed his name to Israel a couple chapters ago, and that's very important because he becomes the nation of Israel, or rather his descendants do. Then we have Joseph. He has been our main character for several chapters. He is a very powerful ruler in Egypt, and he became so after his brothers sold him into slavery when he was 17 years old. God had brought him up out of his slavery and out of prison and made him prominent in Egypt. And then we're going to talk about his 11 brothers. Their names were Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, and the youngest, Benjamin. Where did these events take place? Well, both Jacob and Joseph are going to die in Egypt. Jacob's body, though, is going to be carried to the land of Canaan, and it's going to be buried there, because if you remember, he asked Joseph to do that for him. He didn't want to be buried in Egypt. And just to give you an idea of what's going on in this chapter, we have Jacob and Joseph dying very quickly, and that's because we're on the last chapter of Genesis. The writer here is going to basically finish the story up. Finish up the story of Jacob and his sons and Joseph. And he's going to wrap that up, and then we're going to skip several hundred years as we begin Exodus chapter 1. So bringing it all to a nice conclusion here. And we'll talk about how it ends here in our outline. So let's talk about what we just mentioned, Jacob's burial in Canaan. This is going to be verses 1 through 13. After Jacob, or Israel's death, Joseph commanded the physicians to embalm his father. So this like mummification process as we think about it. This embalming process took 40 days, and the Egyptians mourned for Jacob for 70 days. And after this was accomplished, Joseph asked permission from Pharaoh to go to Canaan and to bury his father, and Pharaoh granted him permission. He set out for Canaan with a rather large company of people. The elders of Egypt went with him, the servants of Pharaoh, chariots, horsemen, and all of the adults of Jacob's household. And when they reached a place called the threshing floor of Atad, they lamented there for Jacob for 7 days. They buried him in the cave of Machpelah, and if you remember, the cave of Machpelah had been in the family since Abraham purchased it back in Genesis chapter 23 from the Hittites to bury his wife Sarah. Abraham was buried there, Sarah, Isaac, Rebekah, and Jacob's wife Leah were all in that cave. And if there's anyone still in that cave today, I don't know if there's ever been any discovery of it or not, but it would be Jacob, because he got embalmed, so he should still be there somehow or another. Maybe I'll make that my later archaeological pursuit, although I'm sure there's many people already looking for the cave of Machpelah. Perhaps they've already found it. I don't know. I'm out of... I haven't done my research on that one. Okay. Let's move on to the next section before I ramble. Verses 14 through 21. Joseph's brothers fear his revenge. After Jacob's burial, the large company of people returned to Egypt. And now that their father was dead, Joseph's other brothers were concerned that he was now going to take his revenge on them for selling him into slavery 35, 40 years earlier. They thought maybe he was just waiting around so he didn't have to grieve his father when he took his vengeance, and that now that Jacob was in the ground and buried and all the ceremonies were over, they were going to get it. And so they sent a messenger to Joseph. They asked for his forgiveness. They told him that even Jacob wanted him to forgive them. And they came before him, bowed before him, and told him that they were his servants. But Joseph reassured them that he had not been waiting around all these years to take his vengeance on them. He told them that they had no reason to fear. Yes, what they had done was evil, but God had turned it and used it for good to save tons and tons of people throughout the very severe 7-year famine that they had experienced. And the Bible tells us that Joseph comforted their anxieties and he spoke kindly to them. So that's how this dilemma that we've been discussing for the last several chapters comes to an end. And it's a good ending to the story. Forgiveness is given and a family is repaired. The final bit of Genesis, verses 22 through 26, discusses the final years of Joseph. So Joseph lived out the rest of his years in Egypt, and he lived to see his great-great-grandchildren through his son Ephraim. Joseph prophesied that a day was coming when God would lead his family back to the land of Canaan and fulfill the promises that he had made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that he was going to give their descendants that land as an inheritance. And Joseph believed that promise, and he told his brothers and his family not to bury him in Egypt, but rather to put his bones aside. And then when the day came when God led them back to Canaan, he wanted his bones to go with them and then to be buried in Canaan. And we're told that Joseph died at 110 years old. He was embalmed like his father, and his body was put in a coffin, but we're not told that it was buried, because of course he's waiting around for God to fulfill his promises. So that is Genesis chapter 50. Thank you to everybody who's been doing this study with us. I'd encourage you to continue. Thanks to everybody who's been leaving encouraging comments. And remember to check out the links down in the description, especially if the physical book is already out. Feel free to use that for Bible classes, to teach family devotions, to whatever it's useful for you. I don't have any hesitation giving it to people because I want good information to make it out into the world. That's part of the reason that this channel exists in the first place. So feel free to do that. And if you purchase a book, it does help to support the channel. I certainly don't make a ton of money off of those books, maybe a couple bucks every time a book is sold, but that adds up eventually, and it all comes back into funding this and keeping it going and helping it run more efficiently. So thank you to everybody who will do that, and thank you to all the patron supporters and the other supporters that we have that keep this material coming and free. Okay, application, our final application from Genesis. What are we going to talk about? Notice that Joseph never forgot his true home despite his prosperity in Egypt. It probably would have been pretty easy for Joseph to say, well, God has been great to us here in Egypt. We're prosperous. Why don't we just plan on making this our home and staying here rather than going back to Canaan where our ancestors were, shepherds and nomads and they had no place to live. Prosperity's pull wasn't powerful enough of a force to cause Joseph to believe that Egypt was a better home for him and his family than the home that God had promised them. Unfortunately, there's a lot of people today that are distracted from and often forget God's promises because they're pursuing wealth, or maybe they've obtained some wealth. After accumulating a little money, a little comfort, they forget about the better home that God has promised to us in heaven. They're content to make their home in Egypt. So we need to be careful about this. Let's keep our eyes and our hope fixed on a better country, on a better home than anything that this world can offer us. And I know that when we get to that home, when we finally find our rest in the presence of God, we're going to be thankful that we made the decision to believe God.